I have spent 40 years cataloging things that outlasted the people who made them. A ship's sextant that crossed 3 oceans before it ended up wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a tea chest. A binnacle compass with someone's initials scratched into the brass. Initials nobody at the museum could account for. If you work long enough with objects of that kind, you start to read age the way a good auctioneer reads provenance. Through the wear, the small adjustments, the places where a thing has been handled so many times the surface has taken the shape of the hands that held it. What you rarely expect is to meet a man and find the same thing written into him. The Maritime Heritage Trust Gala that autumn was held in the ground floor of the old Aldermere Harbormaster's office, converted to a heritage center 3 years prior. The walls still carried the mineral smell of salt timber and old rope, and the overhead lanterns had been replaced with ship's glass reproductions that threw a warm, tilting light across the room. I had organized the evening myself as the Trust's honorary curator, and I was running on the particular anxiety of a man who has counted the chairs 3 times and still cannot satisfactorily account for the one that is migrated. The guests numbered about 50, local councillors, retired sea captains, a scattering of arts patrons, the Trust's modest list of donors. They were well into the soup when Reginald Howe arrived. Howe was that evening's guest of honor, a celebrated broadcaster, 30 years the voice of the late-night music program on Radio 4 that reviewed the week's concerts and told you what to think of them. He had written 2 books on British orchestral history and wore his authority the way some men wear a regimental tie, publicly, and as a statement about what matters. He took his seat at the top table with the ease of a man accustomed to hospitality, accepted a glass with minimal ceremony, and spent the first course scanning the room with the measuring patience of someone noting who might be worth talking to after the port. I noticed Arthur Vane rather later, when the plates had been cleared and the room had settled into its second glass. The Trust secretary had placed him near the back, I think slightly at a loss about where to put a man who had replied yes to the invitation, with no further information about himself. He was in his late 60s, dressed in a jacket that was well made, but clearly old. The kind of old that is not neglect but long use, and he sat with a stillness I associate with people who have kept their own company for extended stretches. Not awkward, not withdrawn, simply present the way a lighthouse is present, quiet and unmistakable at once. I had been introduced to him briefly before the meal. 34 years, at various postings around the British coast, the Orkneys for 7, a spell in the western approaches, 17 years at a station off the North Devon coast that had gone automatic long since. He had spoken about it without sentiment and without apology, which I found I liked. His hands I noticed even then, wide-palmed, the fingers squared off at the tips, scarred across the knuckles with the particular marks of cold and rope and salt. The hands of someone who has worked the sea for a long time, which is not the same as the hands of someone who plays the piano. I made that assumption as naturally as breathing. The upright piano in the corner was a Broadwood, circa 1920, that had come with the building. I had done nothing with it, but someone from the conversion team had taken the trouble to have it tuned, and there it stood beneath a reproduction of an Admiralty chart, slightly out of the way pianos in public rooms always seem to stand slightly out of the way, present, and perfectly disregarded. Nobody had touched it all evening. It was Howe who drew attention to it. He was mid-conversation with the Trust chairman, but had turned in his chair, and I saw his gaze land on Arthur Vane, who was standing near the piano, not playing it, not even resting a hand on it, simply standing in its vicinity, in the way some people gravitate toward windows. Howe raised his voice just enough to carry. "I say, you there, by the piano, the lighthouse keeper, give us something nautical, since you're standing so close. A sea shanty, perhaps, or whatever you fellows play to yourselves out on the water." He said it with the warmth of a man who believes he is being inclusive, drawing the quiet one in, folding him into the room's good cheer. He was not unkind, he was simply absolutely certain, in the practiced way of a man who has spent 30 years sorting the world into musical categories, that he knew what would follow: a polite demurral, or a few apologetic notes, or a good-natured shake of the head. The sea shanty was a test he had already marked. Around me, a small ripple of polite smiles moved through the nearby tables. 2 of the arts patrons exchanged a glance of comfortable anticipation. Arthur Vane looked at Howe for a moment, then he looked at the piano, Then he sat down. He adjusted the bench with a single clean turn of the knob beneath the seat. Not fumbled. Adjusted. With the quiet precision of a man who knows exactly where it needs to be, and has returned to that position so many times the measurement lives in his hands rather than his head. He settled his weight. He placed his hands in his lap for a moment and looked at the keyboard. Not in hesitation, but in the manner of someone recalling something that has been put away for a while and must be found again in the body before it can be played. Then he placed those hands on the keys and played the opening chord of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 17 in D minor. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took perhaps 2 bars, the time required for the nearest tables to register that what they were hearing was not background music, not a polite amateur producing notes in reasonable order, but something of an entirely different nature. The left hand drove the bass with the authority of a tide, contained and purposeful, with the force of something that has a great deal of water behind it. The right hand moved through the upper register with a certainty that was not mechanical but purposeful, the way a skilled man moves through a familiar task because he has done it enough times to know which movements are necessary and which are not. By the 3rd bar, the conversations nearest the piano had faltered. By the end of the exposition, there was nothing left of them in any part of the room. I am not a musical man. I catalog things. I can tell you the provenance of a Kelvin compass from the feel of its gimbals, and date a tide table within 20 years from its typeface. I cannot tell you what separates one performance of a Beethoven sonata from another. What I can tell you is what I saw in that room as Arthur Vane played the first movement, the storm of it, the hammer of the left hand driving while the right hand moved above it, with a certainty that admitted no doubt about where it was going. And what I saw was a room being held. Not politely, not charitably. Held the way a good argument holds you, when you have assumed one thing and are shown another and have no choice but to revise. I watched Howe's face. It had passed through several stages by the development section. The initial ease of anticipated mild entertainment, gone within the first 30 seconds. In its place, a sudden attention, sharp and unwilled. And beneath that, something I would not have expected from a man of his experience. A species of embarrassment, the private kind, not social awkwardness, but professional misjudgment. The expression of a man who has spent 30 years sorting the world into categories and has just watched one of those categories quietly dissolve. Arthur moved into the second movement, the Adagio. If the first had been a storm, the North Atlantic in November, the low sky and the heavy sea, and the necessity of holding course regardless, then the second was the calm that comes after, when the churning has not stopped, but the sky has opened, and there is light on the water, and everything is very quiet and very large. Arthur played it slowly, with a patience that threatened to undo something in me. The phrases breathed. Each arrived and resolved, and left a small silence before the next, and the silences were part of it. Not gaps, but the thing itself, the negative space that gives the positive its shape. The evenness of the voicing, the steadiness of the touch, told me what I was hearing did not come from practicing a thing a few times. It came from practicing it until the practice was no longer the point. I became aware of the woman 3 tables to my left, early 40s, dark-haired, her hands pressed flat on the tablecloth as though she required something solid beneath them. She had come with her husband, and she had not made a particular impression on me before. I noticed now that she was not watching Arthur's hands, as most of the room was. She was watching his face, and on her own face was an expression I had seen before, in 40 years of working with salvaged objects. The look of someone who has been handed something they did not know, had been kept for them, and is only now beginning to understand what it is. She was, I learned afterward, his daughter. She had never heard him play. He moved through the allegretto, the finale's churning return, the tide coming back and making something slightly different of the shore each time, and held the final chord a few seconds, no more. Then he lifted his hands from the keys and placed them quietly back in his lap, and looked at the keyboard with the same unhurried regard he had brought to it at the beginning, as though it were an old agreement between them that required no renegotiation. The silence lasted 4 or 5 seconds. In a room of 50 people, that is a long silence. The first to stand was a retired sea captain from Orkney, who had been talking about winter anchorage all evening. He was on his feet before the applause had organized itself, and for a moment he stood alone, and then the room came up around him, table by table, in the ragged and entirely genuine movement of people who have not conferred about what they are doing, but find themselves doing it together regardless. Arthur's daughter did not stand at once. She sat a moment longer, her hands still flat on the table, her face bright in a way she was working to contain. Then her husband placed his hand over hers, and she stood, and I could see she was not quite composed, though she was managing it with the steadiness of someone who does not want to make the moment about herself. Reginald Howe was the last person in the room to rise. He had sat very still through all three movements, and did not move toward the piano when the applause began. He simply stood, slowly, pressed both hands flat on the table for a moment, before he straightened, and began to clap. There was nothing in the quality of it that resembled the breezy authority with which he had issued his invitation 40 minutes before. He was a man clapping at something he had not been expecting, which is not the same thing as a man clapping at something he has arranged. I found Arthur in the car park afterward, in the single lamp light that smelled of the harbor and the evening's low tide. I asked him how long he had been playing. 32 years, he said. He'd had an upright shipped to each posting at his own expense. Played most evenings once the light was running and there was nothing else requiring attention. He'd been through the tempest a great many times. He had never played in front of anyone before tonight. I asked him why not. He considered it in the way of a man who is not being evasive but is trying to give the question the accuracy it deserves. There was no one there, he said. It struck me, standing in the car park with the harbor smell around us, as the most exact answer he could have given. Not that no audience had ever been available, not that the occasion had never arisen, simply that, for 32 years, at the various edges of the country where he had been posted, there had been no one there. And now there had been, and he had played, and whatever had been tended in those years had entered the room, and the room had received it. His daughter found him a few minutes after I left them. I did not hear what passed between them. I walked back through the harbor master's door to collect my coat, and the converted room was quiet again, and the Broadwood stood in its corner beneath the Admiralty chart, looking exactly as it had looked when the evening began, which seemed to me both impossible and entirely true. I have spent 40 years cataloging things that outlasted the people who made them. I had always supposed that what I was cataloging was absence, the life already finished, the hands already gone. That evening I understood I had been wrong, or at least incomplete. Sometimes what you are cataloging is not a finished thing but a continuing one. Sometimes the man and the object and the life are all still present, in the corner, in the lamplight, waiting only for someone to ask. Sometimes there is no absence at all. There is only the patience of the thing kept ready, and the long practice in the dark, and the one evening, however late it comes, when the room finally goes quiet enough to hear it.